The first sign of trouble came as a violent shudder that rippled through the Stellar Harmony's hull, followed by the ominous groaning of stressed metal. Captain Veltar's scaled fingers danced across his command console, his reptilian eyes reflecting the cascade of red warning lights that had suddenly transformed the bridge into a hellscape of alarms. "Hull breach in Sector 7. Engineer Kicksmall's chittering voice cut through the chaos, his insectoid limbs working frantically at multiple control panels simultaneously. "Atmospheric processors failing. We're losing cabin pressure. Deho." Kim barely looked up from his geological survey data as the ship bucked and rolled around him. 20 years of military service had taught him to distinguish between manageable crises and genuine disasters. The way Sojin Park's knuckles had gone white as she gripped her xenobiology workstation told him this was definitely the latter. "Emergency. Descent protocol initiated," Captain Veltar announced, his usually commanding voice tight with barely controlled panic. The Saurian's cold-blooded physiology meant stress affected him differently than warm-blooded species, but Deho could see the telltale signs of distress in the captain's dilated pupils and rapid breathing. Through the viewports, Kepler 404E2c loomed below them like an angry green-brown eye. What had appeared as a routine survey mission to catalog potential colony worlds was rapidly becoming a survival scenario. The planet's dense atmosphere crackled with electrical storms, and sheets of rain hammered against the ship's hull with a fury that suggested the weather systems here were nothing like the gentle precipitation patterns their preliminary scans had indicated. "Stabilizers are gone." Navigator Bluvin's voice emerged as a series of clicking sounds from his specialized aquatic environment suit. The cetacean's elongated form writhed within the fluid-filled chamber, his panic evident even through the translation matrix. "I cannot maintain our descent trajectory." Deho felt the familiar calm that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments settle over him like a comfortable jacket. While his crewmates struggled with their failing systems, he quickly secured his equipment and moved to assist Sojin, who was trying to protect her biological samples from the increasingly violent motion of the ship. "Leave them," he told her, quietly, his voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms. "Focus on the medical supplies." Sojin's dark eyes met his for a moment, and he saw her own training kick in. As a xenobiologist and trained medic, she understood triage. The samples could be replaced, their lives could not. She abandoned her precious specimens and began gathering emergency medical equipment with the efficient movements of someone who had drilled for exactly this scenario. The impact, when it came, was everything Deho had expected and worse. The Stellar Harmony struck the planet's surface at an angle that sent it skipping across what felt like broken terrain, before finally coming to rest with a grinding crash that seemed to go on forever. Emergency lighting flickered to life as the main power systems failed, casting everything in an eerie red glow. In the sudden silence that followed, punctuated only by the hiss of escaping atmosphere and the drum of rain against damaged hull plating, Deho performed a quick mental inventory. He was bruised but functional. Sojin was checking herself for injuries with practiced efficiency. Around them, their alien crewmates were in various states of distress. Captain Veltar had been thrown from his command chair and lay motionless against a bulkhead, a nasty gash across his scaled forehead, leaking the dark blue blood of his species. Engineer Kicksmall was trapped beneath a fallen console, his chittering sounds indicating pain rather than panic now. Navigator Bluvin's environmental chamber had cracked, and the specialized fluid that kept him alive was slowly leaking across the deck. "Sojin, Veltar first," Deho called out, already moving to free Kicksmall from the debris. The Vespid's exoskeleton had protected him from serious injury, but his right arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Compound fracture," Kicksmall buzzed weakly as Deho carefully extracted him. "My repair appendage is compromised." Working together with the smooth coordination they had developed during their 6-month survey mission, Deho and Sojin quickly triaged their crewmates. Captain Veltar had a severe concussion but would live. Kicksmall's arm needed immediate attention but wasn't life-threatening. Navigator Bluvin was the most critical. His species required specific environmental conditions to survive, and his damaged chamber was failing rapidly. As Sojin worked to stabilize their patients, Daeho conducted a rapid assessment of their situation. The ship's main power was dead. Life support was running on emergency batteries that would last perhaps 6 hours. The hull had multiple breaches, letting in the planet's frigid, rain-soaked atmosphere. Their emergency beacon was damaged, buried somewhere under the twisted wreckage of the communications array. Outside, through the gaps in the hull, he could see a landscape that looked like something from humanity's prehistoric past. Towering, trees with bark-like armor plating swayed in the storm winds. Strange, luminescent fungi provided patches of eerie blue-green light in the gathering darkness. And everywhere, the sound of water, not just rain, but the gurgle and rush of streams and rivers swollen by the constant precipitation. "How bad is it?" Sojin asked quietly, pausing in her work to bandage Captain Veltar's head wound. "Could be worse," Daeho replied, though privately he was calculating survival odds that weren't particularly encouraging. "We're alive, we're mostly functional, and we're on a planet with breathable atmosphere and abundant water. But no rescue beacon, no shelter, and no idea when anyone will come looking for us," she finished for him. Captain Veltar stirred, his vertical pupils struggling to focus. "Status report," he croaked, trying to sit up despite Sojin's restraining hand. "Ship's dead, sir," Daeho reported matter-of-factly. "We're grounded indefinitely. Emergency power won't last the night, and the hull breaches are letting in weather that's well below comfortable temperature ranges for most of our species." Engineer Kixmal's antennae twitched in what Daeho had learned to recognize as extreme agitation. "Without proper environmental controls, without our technology, how are we supposed to survive? My species requires specific humidity levels and temperature ranges. We need to focus on repairs, on getting our systems back online." "With what?" Daeho asked, not unkindly. "The fabrication units are scrap metal. The power cores are cracked. We have what's in our emergency kits and whatever we can salvage from the wreckage." Navigator Bluvin's translated voice bubbled with distress. "My environmental suit can sustain me for perhaps 12 hours in these conditions. After that—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew that cetaceans couldn't survive long outside their specialized aquatic environments. As if to emphasize their precarious situation, a particularly violent gust of wind sent rain spraying through the largest hull breach, soaking everyone in water that felt just barely above freezing. Captain Veltar's scales immediately began to darken, a sign that his cold-blooded metabolism was already struggling with the temperature drop. Daeho stood up, water dripping from his hair, and looked around at his crewmates. 3 different species, each highly intelligent, each representing civilizations that had mastered interstellar travel and technologies that humans were still struggling to understand. And all of them looking at their situation with the helpless expression of people whose tools had failed them. "I'm going to take a look around," he announced, picking up his emergency pack. "See what resources we have to work with." "In this storm?" Kixmal chittered incredulously. "The temperature readings show conditions well below safe parameters for extended exposure." Daeho shrugged into his jacket, simple human clothing that suddenly seemed primitive compared to his crewmates' sophisticated environmental suits. "I've been in worse weather. I'll be back in a few hours." Before anyone could protest further, he slipped through the hull breach and vanished into the storm-lashed darkness of an alien world, leaving his technologically advanced crewmates huddled in their failing shelter, surrounded by the useless remnants of their sophisticated civilization. 3 hours had passed since Daeho disappeared into the storm, and the situation aboard the Stellar Harmony had deteriorated rapidly. The emergency power had flickered and died 40 minutes ago, plunging the wreckage into near-total darkness, save for the eerie bioluminescent glow filtering through the hull breaches from the alien fungi outside. Captain Veltar lay curled in what had once been the navigation alcove, his reptilian body racked with violent shivering. Despite Sojin's best efforts to insulate him with salvaged thermal blankets, his cold-blooded physiology was losing the battle against the planet's frigid atmosphere. His scales had shifted from their normal olive green to a mottled gray-blue, that Sojin recognized as the saurian equivalent of hypothermia. Core temperature dropping below critical thresholds, she murmured, checking her medical scanner, one of the few pieces of equipment still functioning on battery power. Captain, I need you to stay awake. Talk to me about something. Anything. Veltar's voice emerged as a barely audible rasp. Home. Saros Prime. Temperature never drops below 35 degrees Celsius, even during the cold season. Engineer Kicksmall huddled nearby, his compound eyes reflecting what little light penetrated their makeshift shelter. His injured arm was immobilized in an emergency splint, but that wasn't his primary concern. The Vespid's breathing had become increasingly labored, as the humidity levels in the ship dropped well below what his species required for proper respiratory function. Atmospheric moisture down to 12%, he wheezed, his antennae drooping with distress. My spiracles are desiccating. Without proper humidification systems, I cannot process oxygen efficiently. Navigator Bluven was in the worst condition of all. His cracked environmental suit leaked steadily, and the specialized aquatic medium that kept his organs functioning was nearly depleted. The cetacean had grown increasingly lethargic, his responses becoming slower and more confused as his system struggled to adapt to the alien environment. Perhaps, Bluven gurgled weakly, we should have listened to the preliminary atmospheric reports more carefully. The indigenous weather patterns are far more severe than our instruments detected. Sojin moved between her patients with growing frustration. Her medical training had prepared her to treat injuries and illnesses, but she couldn't manufacture the environmental conditions each species needed to survive. She had warming blankets, but no way to power them. She had atmospheric processors, but no functional power cores to run them. Every piece of their advanced technology had become useless metal and plastic without the infrastructure to support it. Where is that human? Kicksmall chittered irritably. He should have returned by now. The indigenous fauna of this planet could be hostile, and he has no proper protective equipment. Dae-ho knows what he's doing, Sojin replied, though she couldn't quite hide her own concern. She'd worked with him long enough to trust his judgment, but 3 hours in an alien storm was pushing the limits of even human endurance. A sound from outside made them all freeze, footsteps splashing through the waterlogged ground around their crash site. Sojin reached for the emergency flare gun, the only weapon they had that didn't require power to function. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by what sounded like dragging or scraping noises. It's me, Daeho's voice called out, and Sojin felt a wave of relief wash over her. I'm coming in and I've got supplies. The human appeared through the largest hull breach, soaked to the skin but moving with purpose. Behind him, he dragged what appeared to be a makeshift sled constructed from a piece of the ship's hull plating. Piled on top were bundles of plant material, long, straight branches, broad leaves, strips of fibrous bark, and smooth stones of various sizes. Captain Veltar raised his head weakly. Report, he managed. Good news and bad news, sir, Daeho said, efficiently stripping off his soaked outer layer and wringing it out. Bad news is there's no sign of civilization within a day's walk, and this storm system looks like it's here to stay. Good news is this planet has everything we need to survive. Engineer Kicksmall's antennae twitched skeptically. That appears to be vegetation and mineral samples. How does plant matter constitute survival supplies? Instead of answering directly, Daeho began sorting through his collection with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. He selected several straight branches, each about 2 meters long and roughly the same diameter. So, Jin, I'm going to need your help with this. The rest of you should conserve your energy. What exactly are you planning? She asked, though she was already moving to assist him. We're going to build a shelter, Daeho replied, examining each branch carefully before setting it aside. Something that will keep us warm and dry without requiring any power source or technology. Kicksmall's compound eyes widened in what Sojin had learned to recognize as Vespid disbelief. You intend to construct a habitat using only organic materials? Without environmental controls, atmospheric processors, or thermal regulation systems? Exactly, Daeho said, beginning to arrange the branches in a specific pattern. Humans built shelters for tens of thousands of years before we developed technology. The principles haven't changed. He had chosen a spot just outside the ship's wreckage, in a natural depression that provided some protection from the wind. Working methodically despite the rain that continued to pour down on them, he began constructing a framework. The branches were interlocked at their ends, creating a dome-like structure that was surprisingly stable despite its simple construction. The key, he explained to So-Jin as she held pieces in place, is understanding how forces distribute through natural materials. These branches are green wood. They'll bend without breaking, and they're stronger when they're supporting each other. Navigator Bluven watched from inside the ship, his deteriorating condition making it impossible for him to venture outside. This seems primitive, he gurgled. Surely our technological approach would be more efficient. Efficient when it works, Daeho replied, weaving smaller branches between the main supports to create walls. But right now our technology isn't working. This will. As the framework took shape, So-Jin began to understand the elegance of Daeho's approach. Each component served multiple purposes. The curved structure shed wind and rain. The interwoven branches created natural insulation, and the entire design could be constructed using nothing but human hands and basic understanding of structural engineering. Captain Veltar struggled to focus on what the human was doing. The Galactic Survey Corps has protocols for emergency shelter construction. Why are you not following standard procedures? Because standard procedures assume we have emergency shelter units, power sources, and fabrication equipment, Daeho replied patiently. When those fail, you fall back on more basic methods. He had begun layering the broad leaves he'd collected over the branch framework, overlapping them like scales on a fish. The pattern was remarkably similar to Veltar's own natural armor. The captain realized dimly through his hypothermic confusion. The leaves shed water naturally, Daeho explained, noticing Veltar's attention. Each one channels moisture to the one below it, and the overlapping pattern means wind can't get underneath to lift them off. Engineer Kixmal watched with growing fascination, despite his skepticism. How do you determine the optimal structural configuration without computational analysis? Experience, Daeho said simply. Humans have been building shelters in hostile environments for longer than any of our species have had technology. We learned what works through trial and error, and that knowledge gets passed down. So Jin found herself impressed by the sophistication hidden within the apparently simple construction. It's biomimicry, she realized. You're copying solutions that already exist in nature. Exactly. These leaves evolved to shed water efficiently. The branch structure mimics how trees distribute load. The dome shape is what birds use for their nests because it's inherently stable. Daeho paused to wipe rain from his face. Our ancestors didn't have environmental suits or atmospheric processors, but they survived ice ages and volcanic winters using principles like these. As the shelter neared completion, Daeho began working on the interior. He used the stones to create a raised platform that would keep them off the wet ground, then laid down layers of the softer plant materials to create insulation. He even constructed a simple drainage channel around the perimeter to divert water away from their sleeping area. This is fascinating from an anthropological perspective, So-Jin said, helping him arrange the final layers of bedding. But will it actually work? Can something this simple really protect us from these conditions? Daeho stood back and examined his work critically. The completed shelter looked almost absurdly primitive compared to the advanced technology scattered around the crash site. An entire dome of branches and leaves that wouldn't have looked out of place in humanity's Stone Age. But it was also clearly functional, designed with an understanding of physics and environmental science that their sophisticated equipment had failed to provide. The transition from the failing starship to Daeho's primitive shelter required careful negotiation. Captain Veltar, despite his deteriorating condition, initially refused to abandon his command post. The concept of leaving advanced technology for what appeared to be a collection of sticks and leaves violated every instinct his civilized mind possessed. This is undignified, he wheezed, his scaled skin now showing alarming patches of deep blue that So-Jin recognized as advanced hypothermia. A Saurian captain does not abandon his vessel for primitive accommodations. A dead captain. Doesn't command anything, Daeho replied matter-of-factly, already preparing to physically carry the reptilian officer if necessary. Sir, with respect, your vessel is a metal box with holes in it. My primitive accommodation is engineered specifically for these conditions. Engineer Kicksmall was the first to capitulate, though necessity rather than conviction drove his decision. His respiratory distress had worsened to the point where each breath was a labored wheeze, and the ship's failing atmospheric systems could no longer provide the humidity his species required. Theoretical analysis suggests, he chittered weakly, that any shelter is preferable to current conditions. However, I maintain significant reservations about the structural integrity of organic construction materials. So-Jin helped support the injured Vespid as they made their way to the shelter's entrance, a carefully designed opening that could be sealed with a flap of overlapping leaves. The moment they stepped inside, Kicksmall's compound eyes widened in surprise. The interior of the hut was remarkably different from its external appearance. What had looked like a crude pile of vegetation from outside revealed itself as a sophisticated microenvironment. The space was noticeably warmer than the ambient temperature, and the constant drumming of rain that had tormented them in the ship was muted to a gentle whisper. Humidity levels are adequate, Kicksmall admitted grudgingly, his breathing already beginning to ease. How is this possible without atmospheric processors? The living materials are still respiring, Daeho explained, helping to arrange the injured engineer on the soft bedding he'd prepared. The leaves and bark are releasing moisture naturally, and the enclosed space concentrates it. The insulation traps your body heat, and the heat from decomposition, creating a stable microclimate. Captain Veltar's resistance crumbled when a particularly violent gust sent icy water cascading through the ship's largest breach, soaking him completely. His scales had begun to lock up, a saurian physiological response to extreme cold that would soon render him completely immobile. Help me with him, So-Jin called to Daeho. He's going into thermal shock. Together, they carried the semi-conscious captain to the shelter. The moment they laid him on the insulated floor, wrapped in the primitive but effective bedding Daeho had prepared, his condition began to stabilize. The trapped body heat and natural insulation worked exactly as the human had predicted. Navigator Bluven presented the greatest challenge. His aquatic physiology made any transition extremely dangerous, and his environmental suit was down to its last few liters of life-sustaining fluid. The cetacean's translated voice had grown increasingly weak and distorted as his systems failed. Cannot survive. Terrestrial environment, he gurgled. Respiratory system requires aquatic medium. Daeho had anticipated this problem. In one section of the shelter, he had excavated a shallow depression and lined it with broad, watertight leaves. Throughout his exploration of the area, he had been collecting rainwater in containers fashioned from hollow plant stems and curved bark sections. It's not ideal, he admitted to So-Jin as they prepared to transfer Bluven. But I've collected about 40 liters of clean water. Combined with what's left in his suit, it should be enough to keep his gills functional. The process of moving Navigator Bluven was delicate and terrifying. For several critical minutes as they drained his failing suit and transferred him to the improvised aquatic environment, his vital signs flatlined. So-Jin worked frantically to stimulate his respiratory system, while Daeho ensured the makeshift pool maintained proper water levels. Then, miraculously, Bluven's gills began to function again. His eyes focused, and his translated voice emerged, stronger than it had been in hours. This is unexpected, he said, his tone filled with wonder. The water temperature is optimal, and the dissolved mineral content appears to be compatible with my physiology. How did you determine the correct specifications? I tested it on myself first, Daeho replied simply. If it's safe for humans, to drink it should be safe for most carbon-based life forms. I also added some of the minerals from your original suit mixture. As the 4 survivors settled into their new accommodations, the true effectiveness of Daeho's construction became apparent. The shelter's interior was divided into specialized zones, each designed to meet different physiological needs. Captain Veltar had been placed in the warmest section, where decomposing organic matter and trapped air created a thermal pocket perfectly suited to his cold-blooded metabolism. Engineer Kicksmile occupied an area where the natural respiration of the living. Walls maintained optimal humidity levels. The Vespid's breathing had returned to normal, and his injured arm was healing faster in the improved environment. Navigator Bluevin's aquatic section was positioned to take advantage of natural drainage patterns, ensuring his pool remained clean and well oxygenated. Sojin had set up her medical station in the central area, where she could monitor all 3 patients while remaining comfortable herself. "This is remarkable," she said to Daeho as they shared a simple meal of emergency rations. "You've essentially created a multi-species life support system using nothing but local materials." Outside, the storm continued to rage with unabated fury. Wind howled through the twisted wreckage of their ship, and lightning illuminated the alien landscape in brief, terrifying glimpses. But inside the humble shelter, all 4 beings rested comfortably, protected by engineering principles that predated their technological civilization by millennia. Captain Veltar, his core temperature finally stabilized, was the first to acknowledge what had happened. "I owe you an apology, Daeho," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the crash. "I dismissed your methods as primitive, but this structure is performing better than our ship's environmental systems ever did." "Different tools for different situations," Daeho replied diplomatically. "Our technology is incredible when it works, but when it fails, sometimes older solutions are more reliable." Engineer Kicksmile, his scientific mind now fully engaged, began examining the shelter's construction with professional interest. "The structural engineering is actually quite sophisticated," he observed, running his good hand along the interwoven branch framework. "The load distribution follows principles we use in our largest orbital stations." "Humans didn't invent these principles," Daeho explained. "We learned them from nature. Trees have been solving structural problems for millions of years. Bird nests demonstrate optimal resource utilization. Beaver dams show how to manage water flow. We just copied what already worked." Navigator Bluevin, floating comfortably in his improvised pool, added his own observation. "On my homeworld, we have ancient stories of our ancestors building temporary shelters during migration periods. But those techniques were lost when we developed atmospheric processors and environmental suits. It never occurred to us that the old ways might still have value." As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, the 4 survivors found themselves engaged in discussions they never could have imagined having aboard their technologically advanced vessel. They talked about adaptation, about the relationship between intelligence and technology, about what it meant to be truly prepared for the unexpected. Sojin documented everything, her scientific mind fascinated by the implications. "We spend so much time developing new technologies that we never consider what happens when they fail," she mused. "But humans never fully abandoned the old methods. You maintained a connection to these survival techniques even after developing spaceflight." "Had to," Daeho replied. "Human history is full of civilizations that became so dependent on their technology that they couldn't survive when it failed. We learned that lesson the hard way." Outside, something large crashed through the forest, probably a tree felled by the wind. Inside the shelter, the sound was muffled and distant, no more threatening than background noise. Their primitive refuge had become a haven of safety and comfort in a hostile alien environment. As the others settled into sleep, protected by walls of leaves and branches, Daeho remained awake for a while longer, listening to the storm and planning improvements for the morning. Tomorrow he would show them how to expand their shelter, how to create tools from local materials, how to find food and purify water using techniques that required no power source beyond human ingenuity. For the first time since the crash, all 4 crew members slept peacefully, warm and dry in their impossible sanctuary built from nothing but sticks, stones, and an ancient understanding of how to work with nature rather than against it. The 7th day after the crash dawned clear and bright, the first break in the relentless storm system that had dominated Kepler 442c's weather since their arrival. Daeho emerged from the shelter at first light, stretching muscles that had adapted to the constant physical labor of survival. Behind him, his 3 alien crewmates were beginning to stir, their recovery nothing short of remarkable. Captain Veltar's scales had returned to their natural olive coloration, and his movements showed the fluid grace of a healthy saurian. The improvised thermal environment had not only saved his life but allowed his cold-blooded metabolism to function more efficiently than it had aboard the climate-controlled starship. The temperature regulation in this structure is superior to our ship's environmental systems, he admitted, examining the shelter's construction with professional interest. How is it possible that organic materials provide better thermal stability than our engineered solutions? Deho knelt beside the shelter's entrance, checking the drainage channels he had carved around the perimeter. Your ship's systems fought against the environment, he explained. This shelter works with it. The living materials respond to temperature, changes naturally. They expand and contract to maintain equilibrium. Engineer Kixamal emerged next, his injured arm now functioning normally, thanks to Sojin's medical attention and the shelter's optimal humidity levels. The Vespid's compound eyes tracked Deho's movements with scientific fascination as the human began his daily routine of maintenance and improvement. I've been analyzing the structural efficiency of your construction methods, Kixamal chittered, producing a piece of bark covered with scratched calculations. The material-to-strength ratio exceeds our standard engineering models by 47%. How did you determine the optimal configuration without computational assistance? Trial and error over thousands of years, Deho replied, beginning to gather materials for the day's projects. Every human culture developed shelter techniques adapted to their specific environment. We inherited the successful experiments and learned from the failures. Sojin had been documenting everything since their second day in the shelter, filling a makeshift journal with observations about human survival techniques and their applications across species. Her xenobiological training gave her unique insight into how Deho's methods addressed the physiological needs of different life forms. It's biomimetic engineering, she said, joining the conversation while checking on Navigator Bluvin's aquatic habitat. But instead of copying nature, you're working within natural systems. The shelter doesn't fight the environment, it becomes part of it. Navigator Bluvin's condition had stabilized dramatically in his improvised pool. The cetacean's skin had regained its healthy luminescence, and his translated voice carried enthusiasm rather than the desperation that had characterized his first days on the planet. The hydrodynamic properties of this habitat are remarkable, he observed. His pool now connected to a network of channels that Deho had carved to manage water flow throughout their settlement. The circulation pattern maintains optimal oxygen levels without any mechanical assistance. Deho had been expanding their capabilities daily, each improvement building on the previous day's work. What had started as emergency shelter had evolved into a sophisticated survival complex. He had constructed elevated platforms for food storage, workshops for tool creation, and even a primitive but effective communication system using polished metal from the ship's wreckage and carefully angled reflectors. Today, we're going to work on making tools, he announced, leading the group to a flat area where he had arranged various stones and salvaged metal pieces. So far, I've been doing most of the construction work, but if we're going to be here much longer, everyone needs to contribute. The concept of manual tool creation fascinated and bewildered his alien crewmates in equal measure. Engineer Kixamal approached the project with scientific rigor, analyzing the molecular structure of different stone types to determine their suitability for various applications. Flint and quartzite show optimal fracture patterns for cutting. Implements, he observed, carefully examining chips of stone through a salvaged optical magnifier. But the process of shaping them appears to require significant manual dexterity. Deho demonstrated the technique with practiced ease, striking precise blows to shape a piece of flint into a sharp-edged cutting tool. It's called napping, he explained. The key is understanding how force propagates through the stone's crystal structure. Each strike has to be calculated based on the grain and the desired outcome. Captain Veltar proved surprisingly adept at the process, his scaled fingers providing excellent grip, and his military training translating into the careful precision required for tool creation. This technique would be valuable for emergency situations, he mused, examining his first successful cutting implement. No power requirements, no complex manufacturing processes, just skill and knowledge. Sojin focused on creating tools for medical applications, working with Daeho to fashion needles from thin metal fragments and suture materials from processed plant fibers. Her background in xenobiology allowed her to identify which local plants had antiseptic properties and which could be safely used for various medical procedures. "The pharmaceutical potential of this ecosystem is extraordinary," she said, carefully preparing extracts from several different specimens. "Some of these compounds could revolutionize emergency medicine, especially in situations where synthesized drugs aren't available." As the days progressed, their settlement took on the characteristics of a functional community. Each crew member had developed specialized skills that complemented their natural abilities and training. Chixamal became expert at creating complex, mechanical devices using only organic materials and salvaged components. His engineering background allowed him to design sophisticated systems like water-powered mills and tension-based mechanisms. Captain Veltar applied his military strategic thinking to settlement defense and resource management. He established patrol routes, created early warning systems using carefully arranged materials that would indicate if large animals approached their camp, and developed efficient schedules for maintenance and expansion projects. Navigator Bluven used his species' natural affinity for fluid dynamics to design increasingly sophisticated water management systems. His aquatic habitat had become the center of a complex network that provided fresh water, irrigation for the food plant Sojin was cultivating, and even a primitive but effective sewage treatment system. "We're becoming more than just survivors," Sojin observed during their evening meal of locally sourced plants and preserved emergency rations. "We're adapting, learning to live as part of this ecosystem rather than separate from it." The psychological transformation was as remarkable as their physical adaptation. The initial panic and helplessness that had characterized their first days had been replaced by confidence and competence. Each successful project reinforced their ability to solve problems without relying on technology, and their growing understanding of local conditions made them increasingly effective at resource utilization. "I've been thinking about our rescue situation," Captain Veltar said, his tone thoughtful rather than concerned. "When the coalition search teams arrive, they'll be expecting to find traumatized survivors requiring immediate medical evacuation. Instead, they'll find us thriving," Kixmal added, his antennae twitching with what Sojin had learned to recognize as Vespid amusement. "The implications for standard survival protocols are significant." Daeho had been working on a new project. Throughout the conversation, a detailed map of their settlement carved into a large piece of bark. Every structure, every improvement, every innovation was carefully documented with notes about construction techniques and resource requirements. "We should document everything," he said, adding finishing touches to his diagram. "These techniques could be valuable for other crews in similar situations." The idea sparked immediate enthusiasm from his crewmates. Captain Veltar began dictating formal reports about the effectiveness of human survival methods compared to standard coalition protocols. Engineer Kixmal started creating technical diagrams of their various innovations, complete with efficiency, calculations, and scalability assessments. Sojin expanded her biological surveys to include detailed analysis of local resources and their applications across different species' physiological requirements. Navigator Bluven worked on hydrodynamic models that could be applied to water management in other environments. What started as emergency survival has become advanced research, Sojin realized, reviewing the extensive documentation they had accumulated. "We're not just learning to live here, we're developing new paradigms for sustainable living without technological dependence." The rescue ships appeared on Kepler 442c's horizon 14 days after the crash, their sleek hulls cutting through the morning mist like silver knives. Commander Yel Shah of the coalition rescue vessel Redemption had expected to find survivors, huddled in emergency shelters, rationing their last supplies while awaiting extraction. What she discovered instead challenged every assumption she held about survival protocols and species capabilities. The crash site of the Stellar Harmony had been transformed into something resembling a thriving settlement. Multiple interconnected structures dotted the clearing, each one built from organic materials but displaying engineering sophistication that made the Altarian commander pause in confusion. Smoke rose from carefully constructed fire pits. Water flowed through an elaborate collection and purification system, and what appeared to be a functional workshop occupied one corner of the settlement. "Are you certain this is the correct location?" she asked her navigator, studying the scene through her ship's sensors. "The beacon signature matches, but these readings suggest an established colony, not crash survivors." "Confirmed, Commander," the navigator replied, his own voice tinged with bewilderment. "This is definitely the Stellar Harmony's last known position, but I'm detecting multiple life signs, all in excellent health, and what appears to be agricultural activity." The rescue team's landing craft touched down near the wreckage of the survey vessel, and Commander Yelshaw emerged with her medical team, expecting to treat traumatized survivors. Instead, she was greeted by Captain Veltar, who looked healthier than he had in his official personnel files. His scales showed the vibrant coloration of a well-fed saurian, and his movements were confident and energetic. "Commander Yelshaw," Veltar said, offering the traditional saurian salute. "Welcome to our temporary home. I trust your journey was comfortable." The rescue commander found herself at a loss for words. Standard protocol dictated that crash survivors should be immediately evacuated for medical treatment and psychological evaluation. The beings before her showed no signs of trauma, malnutrition, or the technological withdrawal symptoms common to stranded crews. "Captain Veltar, we're here to extract you and your crew," she managed. "Medical teams are standing by to treat any injuries or environmental exposure effects." "That's very kind," Veltar replied with what might have been amusement. "But as you can see, we're quite well. Perhaps you'd like a tour of our settlement before we discuss extraction procedures?" Engineer Kicksmile emerged from what appeared to be a workshop constructed entirely from woven branches and leaves. His injured arm had healed completely, and he carried what looked like a sophisticated cutting tool crafted from shaped stone and carved wood. "Commander," he chittered in greeting, "your timing is excellent. We've just completed our water purification upgrade, and I was hoping to demonstrate the filtration efficiency to someone with technical background." Behind him, Sojin appeared carrying a basket woven from plant fibers, filled with what the rescue team's scanners identified as nutritious local vegetation. Her appearance was the most shocking of all. Rather than the pale, malnourished look of a crash survivor, she radiated health and vitality. Her skin was tanned from outdoor work, her muscles toned from physical labor, and her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "You have to see what we've accomplished here," she said to the stunned rescue team. "The biodiversity on this planet is incredible, and the applications for natural resource utilization are going to revolutionize our understanding of sustainable living." Navigator Bluven's voice emerged from a sophisticated aquatic habitat that put some permanent installations to shame. The structure channeled natural water flow to maintain perfect conditions for his species, while integrating seamlessly with the settlement's overall design. "The hydrodynamic engineering principles we've developed here," his translated voice bubbled with excitement, "could be applied to aquatic colonies throughout the galaxy. We've created a closed-loop system that requires no external power source, yet maintains optimal environmental parameters." Commander Yelshaw found herself being led through a settlement that challenged everything she thought she knew about survival technology. Every structure served multiple purposes, every system integrated with every other system, and all of it had been accomplished using nothing but organic materials and ingenuity. "This is impossible," she murmured to her medical officer. "Preliminary scans showed this planet as marginally habitable. How did they not only survive but thrive?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Deho emerged from the forest carrying an armload of materials, his movements efficient and purposeful. Unlike his crewmates, he showed clear signs of hard physical labor, calloused hands, sun-weathered skin, and the lean build of someone who had been living off the land. But like the others, he radiated contentment and health. "You must be the rescue team," he said with a welcoming smile. "I'm Deho Kim, survival specialist, though I suppose that title has taken on new meaning over the past 2 weeks." "Mr. Kim," Commander Yelshaw said carefully, "our preliminary reports suggested this planet presented significant survival challenges. How did you manage to not only survive but establish what appears to be a permanent settlement? Daeho set down his materials. Branches selected for specific properties, stones shaped for particular purposes, plant fibers prepared for construction. The planet isn't hostile, he explained. It just requires different approaches than our technology typically provides. When our equipment failed, we had to adapt. Captain Veltar stepped forward, his demeanor carrying new authority and confidence. Commander, I need to make an official request. I want this entire operation documented and submitted to the Coalition Emergency Protocols Committee. What we've learned here could save countless lives. I don't understand, the rescue commander replied. Engineer Kicksmall's antennae twitched with enthusiasm. Our technological solutions failed because they weren't designed for these specific conditions, but Daeho's methods, he gestured at the settlement around them. These work regardless of power sources, equipment failures, or environmental variables. Sojin had been taking notes throughout the rescue team's visit, documenting their reactions and questions. We want to propose a new training protocol, she said. Every coalition crew should learn these techniques, not as backup procedures, but as primary survival skills. The implications were staggering. Commander Yelshah looked around the settlement again, seeing it with new eyes. What she had initially dismissed as primitive construction was actually sophisticated engineering, adapted to local conditions. The beings she had come to rescue were proposing to revolutionize coalition survival protocols based on techniques that predated spaceflight. This will require extensive review, she said slowly. The Coalition Council will need to evaluate. Already documented. Captain Veltar interrupted, producing a detailed report written on material made from processed plant fibers. 14 days of comprehensive data on construction techniques, resource utilization, multi-species environmental adaptation, and psychological effects of technology-independent survival. Navigator Bluvin's aquatic habitat bubbled as he added, "We've also identified 17 different applications for these techniques in existing coalition operations. Emergency protocols, long-term exploration missions, colony establishment procedures, all could benefit from integration of human adaptive methods." 3 months later, on the Coalition training station orbiting Rigel 7, Daeho stood before a class of 43 cadets representing 12 different species. Rain pelted the training ground outside, artificially generated but chemically, identical to the conditions on Kepler 442c. "Your emergency shelters have all failed," he announced to the group of young officers huddled in their disabled evacuation pods. "Your communication equipment is offline, your power sources are depleted, and rescue won't arrive for at least 10 days. What do you do?" A Vespid cadet raised her appendage tentatively. "Instructor Kim, shouldn't we attempt to repair our technological systems first?" "That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets crews killed," Daeho replied, not unkindly. "Technology is a tool, not a crutch. When your tools break, you need to know how to work without them." He gestured toward the forest surrounding their training area. "Everything you need to survive comfortably is out there. The question is whether you're smart enough to recognize it and skilled enough to use it." As the cadets reluctantly abandoned their disabled shelters and began to explore their environment, Daeho felt a familiar satisfaction. Captain Veltar's report had indeed revolutionized coalition protocols. Emergency survival training now included extensive education in what the official documents called human adaptive techniques, though Daeho preferred to think of them simply as common sense. The training programs had spread throughout coalition space, and preliminary reports showed a 97% improvement in survival rates for crews stranded in challenging environments. More importantly, the psychological profiles of graduates showed increased confidence, adaptability, and resourcefulness across all species. A young Saurian cadet approached hesitantly. "Instructor Kim, I've found some suitable branches, but I'm uncertain about the structural